The positive aspect of money and emotions is one thing that I don't think people talk enough about.
Like people can look at money in a negative light 100% of the time.
One thing that I hear so often is people telling me money controls me. Instead of money controlling you, you control your financial destiny.
Let's talk about it. Should you be saving money or paying off debt? Because doing both at the same time can sometimes feel like running in place. Welcome back to In My Finance Era. I'm Allie. This is the podcast where we break down the real money decisions you're navigating to help you take your next best step. Today, we're getting into one of the biggest tensions in personal finance, paying down debt versus building savings, and how to prioritize what matters most for you in your situation. I'm joined by creator Mikey Coloca and senior behavioral economist at Vanguard, Paulo Costa. Excited to have you both. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
This is going to be fun.
Very excited. Mikey, you invest in yourself and your future. You've been on a paying down debt journey, and you're really passionate about your finances. What makes you so motivated to pay off your debts and to think about your long-term financial strategy?
Well, passionate, I guess, about a lot of different things at the moment. Right now, my biggest thing is my house. Like my house is like my pride and joy. I'm just like, I'm like waiting to see it finish being built. But as far as like passion goes, I think just like it was actually very difficult for me at the beginning to be passionate. It's when you don't really know what's going to happen, the discipline that comes with it, the baby steps that comes with it. So when I first started, I wasn't as passionate, but as I've gone on and I'm seeing things kind of like my debt go away and now savings going up, I think that's the momentum is kind of what helps build some passion around that.
Yeah. And you mentioned too, kind of very relatable, like building that momentum and how do you kind of set forth on a great strategy that works for you. That's why I'm so glad we have Paula with us today, a researcher dedicated to learning, sharing all things financial, debt, saving strategies. Paulo, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. I'm one of those creatures that study how people make money decisions. And it's really fascinating to see, the theory marrying with their reality. So we're excited to be together.
Yes. Well, maybe let's start. When I think about kind of debt paying down versus saving, right? And this is as a larger, broader theme, I think about emotions. And sometimes I feel like talking about money can be super emotional. It can be stressful and difficult to talk about, but it can also really be something that's very energizing and exciting, depending on what stage you're at and where your mindset is. We recently ran a Vanguard survey, and it showed that 42% of 18 to 34-year-olds see investing as a way to make a difference in the world and support values that they care about. So lots of emotion there, both from a positive and a negative. Paulo, can you talk to us a little bit more about the emotions with paying off debt and your saving strategy, but also how you can work it together with logic when making your financial decisions?
That's a great question because usually when we talk about money emotions, they really tend to be negative, right? People think about financial stress. If you look at the surveys, what we see is that most people in the US feel financially stressed. There is a stat that the average American spends between 7 to 8 hours every week thinking about money. So that's a constant, cognitive load, the stress behind money. But then there's the other side of it. And Mike just mentioned this, which is, he's really excited about his house. And the positive aspect of money and emotions is one thing that I don't think people talk enough about. The momentum that you build when you're doing something positive. Maybe you're saving for your child's education. Maybe you buying a house or building a house. And that positive, emotion is one of the things that I think is really underrated and we should be talking more about. And the logic behind, money is really what's going to propel you to, meet the moment and make the financial decisions that will be helpful to you in the future.
And I really wish like some people knew just the tiny little wall between like knowing and not knowing. Like for me, when I was, like you said, like the bad stress, I guess like stressed out about finances, you said 7 to 8 hours. I think about it probably 7, 8 hours a day. So a week is insane. But for me, it was thinking about it and being stressed and in a negative sense, but just the little hurdle that I had to take to start caring about it that made it more positive. And now I'm like, I'm excited about it.
I'm just like you. So, I have a PhD in money, and I think about money all the time.
Yeah.
From the moment I was born, I was thinking about money. And I think one of the things that is really interesting about this is that our experiences shape how we, think about money. Like I grew up in Brazil and, I was low income back then. And, that scarcity mindset when it comes to money, was one thing that defined, how I grew up with money. But then, being a financial professional now and realizing where that comes from And what are the things that I can do to feel better about money and be able to communicate that to people is, one of the greatest gifts.
Love that.
You both mentioned this kind of idea of control. So growing in your education and understanding what you can change to get you to the life that you want. Let's dive a little bit more into something that we can control, which is prioritizing debts we might have. How do we approach the prioritizing paying off debts? Which one do we start with? And what are some of the things we should know about that when we start on our kind of debt pay down journey?
I love that question because one thing that I hear so often is people telling me money controls me. And that usually comes from a situation in which when people have high interest debt. And this idea that this debt is working against me. And, a great question is how can we help, making those people feel better? And I think one of the things that comes top of mind is paying your high interest debt as fast as you can. And when we're talking about high interest debt, we're thinking about, credit cards, payday loans. If you have debt that is above, 8%, that's usually considered high interest debt. And by all means, if you can, pay that down as quickly as you can, because that compound interest is working against you the whole time. So making sure that getting rid of that, high interest debt is really, really important as a first step to, making you feel more secure and taking control of your finances. Instead of money controlling you, you control your financial destiny.
Yeah. And Mikey, you mentioned in the beginning kind of your debt pay down journey. And when you started, you were nervous or apprehensive. Were you thinking about any of those things in that kind of prioritization model? Or did you do something differently and hearing it? How does that change your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, from the outsider's perspective, because I know there's going to be people watching this that are going to hear high interest debt and they're already freaking out.
Yeah.
Like me personally, I think everybody else should do the same thing, is you need to take the initiative to look at your finances. I think that's the one step everyone's missing out on, is they're just not wanting to look out of fear and the negative emotion. I think when I decided to look is when things started changing, because now I was more educated on my situation. But one thing that I personally did, I micro-paid, I call it micro-paying, towards my debt. So obviously with the momentum of my content, I was able to make bigger payments over time.
Mikey, I have a point about this because, what made you so open to talk about your finance? Because I've seen you talking about that and paying down debt and saving for your house. Because one of the way that I like thinking about emotions, that are two things. One is how you feel.
Yeah.
And then the other part is how other people make you feel. Is just the internal and the social aspect of it. But how did you, become so courageous to talk about finance so openly?
It wasn't easy. I'm going to be honest with you. Like before I started making content, I was very I wouldn't say adamant, but I was a little bit nervous going into it because people could take it the wrong way. Like people can look at money in a negative light 100% of the time. So when they hear the word finance or just budgeting in general, it's like a trigger word. So for me, I was never able to find somebody out there that made me feel comfortable enough to start getting better with money. So I wanted to be that person for other people, kind of like an older brother. Like, hey, dude, it's fine. I know you don't want to look at it, but just look at it, dude. Who cares, So that's the position that I took. And it's worked for me so far.
I was giving a talk once and I was talking about budgeting because, as we say, it's a tool for awareness, right? Where do you stand? And this person came to me afterwards and said, you use the forbidden B word.
Oh my gosh.
And this idea of budgeting being a tool to restrict you. But it is not. It's a tool for you to understand where are you and where could your money be going? And then making sure that in the end of the day, you really know, well, did I spend too much on something? Or the other aspect of it, which is when we talk about budgeting, we talk a lot about, cutting down expenses. But there is also the other aspect that, Mikey, you embody so well is you can also think about making more money. And how can I do that? Through more education or through a side gig.
Yeah.
You name it. But budgeting, it is not only a tool to restrict you, it's also to empower you to understand where your financial situation is and where you can go.
I love the budgeting tool, and maybe we can take it to kind of some other specific methods that people can use or learn or look more into. And we've talked about this debt and the way that it changes your kind of emotional logic about your finances and being able to be an investor. In our recent Vanguard survey, we also learned that 32% of 18 to 34-year-olds feel that they have too much debt to be considered an investor, which is just a crazy statistic. And so maybe we can dig in a little further now that we know how to prioritize those debts. How should we pay them down? What are some methods that we can follow kind of beyond the budgeting that we talked about already to pay down our debts?
When it comes to budgeting, Mikey, what's your favorite budget strategy? Because I have thoughts about all of them, but I want to hear,
Well, okay, so this is where people are going to start hearing French because like I'm going to start saying numbers and people are going to be like, what the heck is that? For some reason, I've always enjoyed looking at money like a pie, almost like percentages. So like the 50, 30, 20. Yep. That's what I use. So when I get paid, I take a chunk of it and I put it towards my needs, my bills. I take a chunk of it and I put it towards my spending, the things that I should be kind of making myself happy with. And then my future, my investing, my saving, whatever.
When you started using that method, was it hard? Like when you when you started on your budgeting journey, was it tough to get into using the 50, 30, 20? Yeah. And like, how did you talk to yourself about, no, I can do this. I can make it happen.
Yo, when I got paid and I saw like whatever, $1,800 hit my account, I didn't want that $1,800 to go away. That $1,800 looked real good right there in my checking account. But then I had to take a piece out for this, take a piece out for this. And then I'm left with like this much left. And I'm like, God. So yeah, it was very difficult at first, but it's like, that's the thing is that I don't think people really truly understand that budgeting is not meant, like you said, it isn't meant to restrict you, but it's meant to kind of like lay out the groundwork. And then once you get it going, it's almost like you're on cruise control. Like everything is basically like set up like basically for yourself. You're setting everything up for yourself.
The reason why I asked this, my favorite method is pay yourself first. After the money hits your account, before you do anything, you set aside, how much you want.
Immediately
to then do, to your question, to save money or to pay down debt. And I think one of the things that, it's so important, I think for people to understand is really the point that, paying down debt is actually saving money. And the reason why, I'd like that people understand this is that paying down debt comes with, at times shame. People's like, I have that and I shouldn't have had that in the first place. And then, not all debt is created equal. There is good debt, there is bad debt, and we can talk about the distinction about that. But one thing that is so important for people to understand is when you have that, when you set aside money to pay that, you both, saving money because you're not spending that money, you're putting that towards your goals. But the second part is you're also saving on the future interest in that debt. So this idea that, saving money is a positive thing and paying down debt is a having that is something that the stigma needs to end. Yeah. You making progress towards your financial goals both ways. And the way that I would frame this is you can do actually, both. If the interest rate is high, paying down that debt, but then you can think about doing other things, maybe meeting your employer match, building your emergency fund. There is so many things that you can be doing while you're paying down debt. So it is not either or, you can do both. But the important thing is creating the capacity through budgeting, using the forbidden B word to make sure that, you know where your money is going and you know the next steps that you're taking.
Yeah, it's so important. And it's so hard to sometimes make that distinction because you're right. There's this like negative aura around debt and, oh my gosh, I have to pay this off. Did you ever feel like that when you first started paying down your debts? Like, oh my gosh, like, did you ever talk to your friends about it, your followers about it? Did you hear this from other people as well? This kind of negativity around debt and feeling like you have to pick one or the other?
I mean, yeah, it's shameful. I mean, I think the really sad part about it is like the way that everything is sort of set up for us is like, you go to school, you're told, go to college, you get your job. Sadly, things happen in life where I wasn't able to get a job after school and I was in student loan debt. So like, there's a bit of shame on it. Like I'm over here drowning in debt. I have 20,000 of it. And I'm sure there's so many of you guys that might have more. So I think there is a bit of shame behind it.
I think you expressed the point that not all debt is created equal. One example is, debt to fund education. Right? You are, increasing your human capital. And by that, I mean your capacity to make money for the rest of your life. That's one asset that doesn't show up in any spreadsheet, right? We don't look at Mikey and say, oh, your human capital is this much, that doesn't happen. But then there is the other type of debt to fund consumption. Well, maybe I shouldn't have gone to that, expensive French restaurant and I didn't have the money to pay for that. Well, that type of debt to fund consumption, that's usually going to be high interest. If you can't pay it, probably it's not a good idea to start. So, and I love the idea, that you're mentioning that, talking about that, people can feel ashamed.
Yeah.
But in the end of the day, you just said, you did it to fund education. But then you realize, wow, if I didn't get a job, I need to do something else. And I think this idea of, taking control of your finances, understanding your situation, and then take the next step that is going to help you the most. I mean, it's super analytical and it makes sense.
Yeah. So we've covered a little bit on how to prioritize our debt, how to pay it down, some things we can get started, some different methods, which was really helpful. Maybe we pivot to this idea of an emergency fund. So once we've got our debts we're under control, we're feeling good about our pay down strategy, what else should we start building with our savings? And is it the emergency fund that comes first?
Yeah. So, I mean, the way that I like to think about, taking control of your money and your finances is probably the highest, benefit that you can get is meeting your employer match if you work. A lot of people say, that's basically money that you get from your employer. So you should take advantage of that. Then the second one would be paying down the high interest debt, probably rule of thumb above 8%, you should pay that down. So some research that my team did last year is that the number one thing that you can do that is associated with increasing your financial well-being the most is actually just saving $2,000 in emergency savings. And, this is one of the things that we saw that when people had that safety net just there, was associated with reducing the amount of time they spend thinking about their finances that we talked in the beginning. Mm-hmm. So that cognitive load of, spending less time thinking about your finances because you have that buffer. I still remember when I found my emergency savings the first time, when I was studying my PhD, like stipends in different schools. And one of the schools said, we cannot increase, your stipend every year, but we can give you $10,000 right now. And then, after tax, that came down to me as $8,000. I remember that day that, that money hit my account and I had, I was just on, my elbows looking at those $8,000 on my, my checking account and just thinking about, oh my God, I'm so rich.
I'm $8,000. Yeah.
But because, I mentioned that I grew up low income, but that meant that if something happened to my parents back in Brazil, I could take a flight down there, no problems. And, many years later that did happen. But, that mental burden,
it's like security.
It really is.
Yeah.
Mike, how did you feel when you first funded your emergency savings and, how did that feel to you?
I mean, honestly, it feels great. It's like a security thing. I mean, it's interesting you said $2,000 because nowadays, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing necessarily, but people wouldn't typically say 3 to 6 months of expenses could be a good emergency fund. That's kind of what you hear on the internet these days. 3 to 6 months of expenses is a lot of money. Like, it's a lot of money, especially with expenses going up. It's very difficult to save that much money. So I think $2,000 is much more attainable for some people. But me personally, when I had an emergency fund, dude, I was like you. I was sitting there like,
yeah,
I was happy. But I mean, it's just a sense of security. It's like knowing, like you said, your family, me, my family, if my tire pops, if whatever, things, life just life sometimes.
Absolutely. And if you want to be disciplined, one tip for a lot of people, because the other question that we get a lot is like emergency fund, I have my $2,000 and I want to build it 3 to 6 months. How can I make sure that that is put in a good place? Mm-hmm. One tip is you can actually use a Roth IRA for that as well. Mm-hmm. Because, contributions and only contributions from a Roth IRA can be withdrawn like tax and penalty free. Mm-hmm. So it's really one way where people can have, their money invested for something that is more long-term. But at the same time, if they need it, they can tap that money as well.
Yeah.
So there is the opportunity to be doing, more. That's why it's so important to be, financially educated, because there are ways in which you can optimize things and do two things at once. Have retirement savings, but also at the same time, emergency savings. So making sure that you're informed, you're grounded. I think that's one of the things that really can help everybody in the long term.
You mentioned tire pop and different things. Is there ever a time how do you figure out when to spend your emergency fund, right? Because then we kind of get this emotional tie to it. We're like, oh yes, all right, it's there. How do you know when to rip the Band-Aid off though and spend it on a true emergency versus maybe on something that might not be emergency and more of a want than a need? Have you ever found yourself in that situation?
I mean, like if I'm craving like some Korean barbecue, like that's not an emergency. I'm not dipping.
That too, by the way.
That's it's an emergency that I'm craving that, and I should go get it. But it doesn't mean I'm going to tap into my emergency fund to pay for it. But if my tire pops, and like if I ask myself, was I expecting this? And is this something that I have to get fixed immediately? Then yeah, I will dip into my emergency fund and pay for it. That actually just happened to me like a month ago. I was driving, tire popped. Don't know what the heck happened. Had to get
And
new tires.
Mike, I love the way that you framed, you know, some people just say so easily, you should have 3 to 6 months saved.
Yeah, it's not that easy.
And it's not that easy. And I mean, the two things that we, like talking about here at Vanguard is number one is that, start small. So, build up to those $2,000. And the way that I build it up is that I got a windfall. Maybe you get a tax refund. And that's one way to, capturing that windfall and making that into your emergency fund. But the second part of the 3 to 6 months is that it's something that you build up to.
Yes.
By definition, you cannot, build up 3 to 6 months in less than 3 to 6 months, right? Because otherwise you won't consume anything, So I think this idea that is something that you like slowly build up to is just really important. And the other thing too is, like you said, lives, right? So sometimes, people lose jobs or they have to cut down, expenses because something happens. People's income also varies so much, right? Mikey, you are an influencer, Tell me a little bit of, how does that change, month to month, week to week?
I mean, dude, we're talking between 5 and 4 figures some months. It can go like 10,000 a month. It can go 1,000 a month. I mean, you really never know. But I think like understanding that there is volatility, I will, live accordingly to that. Like when I said, if I have this Korean barbecue in mind, I won't eat it every week just because I know that something could happen in my life. But yeah, like there's always going to be volatility. There's always going to be uncertainty in people's lives. But that's like you said earlier, this is like more like the negative, but there's also the positive. A raise at work. You might get a new job. Like you can make a $10,000, $20,000 now new income. Maybe you got a new job. I have no idea. So there's always a positive to the negative, but understanding that life can change and just adapting as you go, living and understanding that if you have an emergency fund, you're covered.
Absolutely. And that's why for us, understanding more and more that our income like varies month to month and expenses, obviously that goes without saying, right? Sometimes, you go to a vacation and then sometimes, it's talking about spending money. It makes me nervous,
Yeah.
But that idea of having the buffer in place, and, we are thinking about, the $2,000 that we just talked about, building it up to like having a buffer of 3 months of expenses. So having a buffer of 3 months of expenses, making sure that you have that, safe ground and making sure that you both, have that, probably in a high yield account, making sure that you're getting interest for that money.
I hope it's in a high yield account because
right?
Gosh.
Yeah.
Some people are losing out on interest, man.
Absolutely. So making sure that we are making progress towards our goals, but, having your finances under control, prepare for the unexpected, that just relieves so much mental stress. And that makes a big difference. Mikey, tell me a little bit about now, you are about to reach the goal for your house.
Yeah.
How does that feel?
I mean, it feels good. I was in the same position that maybe the person watching this is. I was scared. I was petrified, actually. I was drowning in debt, paid off my debt, and I took little brick by brick by brick, every day, daily decisions, a lot of no's, barely any yeses, but just understanding that, it's an overtime thing, man.
Or you can be scared like I was too, and you go get a PhD in money. Or you can do what Mikey did.
Yeah, PhD or you make content, man. You pick.
We've covered so much, all about debt, kind of our prioritization breakdown of what we should do, how we should tackle it, some things we can do to pay it off. Thank you both so much for being here. Mikey, any last questions for Paulo before we wrap?
Yeah. So I hear this a lot. I know that people, like we've talked about emergency funds, but right now an emergency fund might not be in the plan for somebody. I don't know, because maybe they're in debt. How can somebody balance paying off high interest debt, but also building up an emergency fund? How can they balance that at the same time?
I think that's a great question. It's something that we hear a lot. And one of the things that I would say is, for the emergency fund, start really small. It's $10 a week, $20 a week, up to you. The other thing that, I think people think a lot about too is, I'm not making enough money. Sometimes it's not a question of, I want to do what's right. I just don't have enough. And that's one of the moments that, there is only so much that you can cut when it comes to expenses, right? Everybody, have to pay rent, you have to pay a mortgage, but are there opportunities to make additional money and use those, that additional money to make sure that you're funding, your emergency fund and paying down debt. And the other thing too that is super important is just a separation of what's high interest debt and what's low interest debt. Low interest debt is something that you don't need to be as, pressed to pay down. One example is, during the pandemic, a lot of people got mortgages at a 3%, 4%, in the financial market, in a diversified portfolio, like in the long run, that could be something that you could make more money having that money invested than you'd be paying down debt. It is a personal decision. Some people are super debt averse and say, like, I want to get rid of this as soon as I can. But in the end of the day, what I think it comes down to is, there is the logic behind all of this that I just mentioned. But in the end of the day, use the logic, but also think about what works for you. Starting small with those $2,000 of emergency savings in case something unexpected happens, and then building up to those 3 to 6 months. That once again, it will take time. Yep. Building that momentum and the idea that small steps can really go a long way is one thing that I wish, people could take away from this is really you start small, but it really will lead you to something bigger.
You just taught me something, Paulo.
Oh, good. That's what we're here for.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much for being here. It was so awesome to have this conversation, talk a little bit more, learn from you, Paulo, get your expertise and your experiences, Mikey. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
That question of whether to save or pay down debt isn't always straightforward, but hopefully today helped you think about it in a more personal and practical way. If you'd like to share your thoughts or questions, you can connect with us on social media. Send us a message there. And for additional resources, head over to inmyfinanceera.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.